King Théoden is one of the most legendary characters in the Lord of the Rings saga, given some of the best lines in the books and films. However, what if I were to tell you that his character and the scenes that he's involved in the Two Towers are completely different from Tolkien's writings? Everything from Gandalf's exorcism to the burial of his son Theodred to his cowardice in fleeing to Helm's Deep are completely rewritten, revised, and recreated from Tolkien's original work. As I set out to compare our first encounter with Théoden in the Two Towers movie to the corresponding chapter in the book, I was shocked at just how much was completely fabricated or changed for the film. The character we see in the movie is almost unrecognizable from what we get in the book, but somehow it actually works. My name is Gibby, and welcome to episode 27 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, Lord of the Rings edition. This is the show where I compare Peter Jackson's adaptation of The Lord of the Rings to Tolkien's original books to find every single difference just for the fun of it. Today, we're covering Gandalf's arrival at Edoras along with our three other main characters and comparing it to Tolkien's chapter, The King of the Golden Hall. What surprised me most about this set of scenes wasn't so much the fact that things were changed, but actually that this massive character revision worked so well for the film. The changes that we're going to dive into today set Théoden up for one of the greatest character arcs in the entire series, as we see him go from coward to hero. Sadly, we don't get to see the heroic payoff just yet, but by the end of this video, I think you'll have a renewed respect for Peter Jackson's ability to adapt Tolkien's work to a film format. Before we go any further, I did want to shout out this commenter. Each week I highlight one of my favorite comments, so be sure to share your thoughts down below when you're done watching. Plus, subscribe if you want to stay tuned for more book to film analysis, as I do this series every single Saturday. Per usual, I'll cover the changes across the four major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's recap what happened in these scenes of the movie. FYI, this is going to be a very condensed summary, as the set of scenes I'm covering today take up about 25 minutes in the movie, so hold on tight as we blast through this movie recap. Picking up from where we left off last week, we see our four companions riding towards Edoras, but before we continue with them, we cut to Éowyn trying to tell King Théoden about the death of his son. We then see her weeping over her dead cousin, and then Wormtongue comes in and does his usual creepy thing. Then we cut back to our four riders as they arrive at the Hall of Meduseld. Upon arrival, they have their weapons confiscated as they walk into the Golden Hall of Meduseld. After Wormtongue says that they aren't welcome, Gandalf reveals his staff, which was the only thing not taken from them, and he goes up to Théoden and casts out Saruman's spirit. Théoden, now feeling better, takes Grima Wormtongue outside and tries to kill him, but noble Aragorn stops this murder and lets Wormtongue run out of the city. Théoden then asks where his son is, and we cut to a burial scene as Éowyn sings a lament for Theodred. After Gandalf and Théoden talk at Theodred's burial mound, Gandalf looks out and sees two children riding towards the city on a horse, and then we cut to inside the Golden Hall as Théoden finally hears the news of the burning of the Westfold. Now he has a decision to make, and instead of deciding to fight as Gandalf advises him, he decides to flee with his entire population to Helm's Deep, where he will wait out the war. Gandalf, obviously frustrated, leaves the town and tells Aragorn to look for him on the 5th day. The plan is that Gandalf will go try to find Éomer and the other riders of Rohan and bring them to Helm's Deep. We then see Aragorn tame a horse, and Éowyn is impressed with his Elvish, and then we cut to Saruman with Wormtongue. Grima informs Saruman of the news and tells him that Théoden will flee with the people to Helm's Deep. He also tells Saruman that a ranger wearing a strange ring was with Gandalf, and Saruman realizes that this could be the heir of Isildur. The movie cuts back to Edoras and we see a stream of people walking out of the city. Then we see Éowyn inside the Golden Hall practicing her fighting. She almost kills Aragorn, who deflects her blade, and they share another moment as she tells him that she doesn't want to be left behind when she can fight. Finally, we see Grima telling Saruman that they will be slow as they travel to Helm's Deep, and Saruman dispatches his warg riders to intercept them and kill as many as possible. And that is where we'll cut off for this week. Like I said, please don't rush to the comments to point out something I missed, because I already know that I just condensed 25 minutes into a very short summary. But for the most part, that's what we see in the film. By the way, I am planning on doing a bonus episode at some point where I cover all the extended scenes in one video, just so people who haven't seen the extended cuts know what they're missing. But for the time being, I highly encourage you to watch the extended version if you don't recognize all the scenes that I'm covering. That being said, let's hop into the character, timeline, and location changes. First, for our character section, it's a little larger this week because I need to address something more than just names. But as for names, we are only missing Éomer. In the books, he is an Edoras since he was never banished like they show in the movie. Rather, he simply got imprisoned. But beyond that character change, Peter Jackson changed a lot of the aesthetic of the Men of Rohan. Personally, I like the more medieval, rugged look that they went for in the movie, but Tolkien writes them as being slightly more put together than that. Not saying that all of them would have long, shiny blonde hair like elves, but in the book, Hama is specifically described as having golden hair that was braided on his shoulders, whereas the movie portrays him and the other men with red and brown hair, which is mostly unbraided. Théoden's look in the movie does not match the book either. Much like I previously mentioned about the Men of Rohan in general, Théoden himself had long, thick white hair, braided in golden circlets. Plus, even though he was bent and old, his eyes were piercing and bright. The movie shows the opposite in an attempt to clearly communicate the spell that's over him, but his blurry eyes and crazy Einstein hair is the opposite to the book description. Lastly, the Men of Rohan speak their own native language in the book. Understandably, to make this simpler for the movie, they just had the men speak plain English. Now, as for timeline and location, these are a lot simpler. For timeline, I think it's pretty accurate, but let me know if I missed something in the comments. Location has one change, which I'll get to more in the plot changes, but for now, just know that the movie omits the Hold of Dunharrow. In the book, they don't all go to Helm's Deep, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves there as that has way more to do with the plot. So that being said, let's jump into the next section. Really quick, I just wanted to remind you guys that I can't cover each line of dialogue as that would take forever. I'll do my best to be as detailed as possible, but if you're looking to relive these conversations for yourself each week as I do the series, I highly encourage you to pick up the audiobooks. If you're looking for a free trial, you can use my Audible link in the description to claim a free trial along with one free audiobook. Anyway, let's get into the changes. The first change we have for these scenes comes very quickly in the first few pages of this chapter. In the book, our four companions don't enter Edoras as easily or as swiftly as the movie shows. Honestly, this makes a lot more sense, as in these dire times, why would the city just allow their gate to be kept open for anyone to enter? In the book, as our four characters come to Edoras, they get stopped at the gate by many men of Rohan who speak in their native tongue. Gandalf speaks back to them in their language and requests that they speak in the common tongue, but the men inform him that they're under strict orders to not let any strangers in who don't know the native Rohirrim speech. They then ask if the companions are spies of Saruman, as they recognize Gandalf as a wizard, but they do mention the horses look familiar. At this, Aragorn speaks up and tells them not to be alarmed, as they are right to recognize the horses, as they are indeed horses lent to them by Éomer. After a bit more dialogue, Gandalf tells the guard of the horse he is returning, Shadowfax the Great, and shares all their names so that the guard can go inform the Lord of the Mark of their arrival. The guard, having returned from informing Théoden of their arrival, told them that they can continue, but they must give their weapons to the door warden once they get to the Golden Hall, even if it's just a staff. As you can tell, we are getting some foreshadowing for the next encounter in which Gandalf keeps his staff, but ultimately I think they cut this whole interaction at the gate for time. That being said, what we're about to get into is where that whole time argument might fall apart, as many of these scenes were completely made up and fill up time perhaps unnecessarily, but I'll leave that up to you. The next scene, in which we see Éowyn with the king and then Grima being creepy, is one of those made up moments. Although we do know that Wormtongue was after Éowyn, which we'll address later in this video, we don't get any details on the exact interactions that they might have had together. And more specifically, because Theodred never came back to Edoras and then died there, these scenes don't make much sense. Éowyn doesn't inform the bewitched king that his son has died, because that has already happened, and then Grima doesn't comfort Éowyn while she's beside her dead cousin, because, well, he's not there. Anyway, now that we've covered that made-up moment, which, by the way, isn't the last one, let's get into Gandalf's confrontation with Grima and Théoden. The next part of this scene in the movie shows Gandalf and company arriving at the door to the Golden Hall, handing over their weapons, except the staff, and then heading inside. Of course, what is just a minute in Jackson's film is a much longer encounter in Tolkien's version. However, it isn't just time being condensed, because that can be forgiven. Rather, this moment in the book has a few golden nuggets of information that are key changes in the film. Chiefest of these changes is Aragorn's sword, Anduril, which in the movie he has yet to receive, but in the book he has been carrying since the very beginning. Here's what happens in the book. As they arrive at the door, they are greeted by the guards, one of whom is Hama. Hama greets them and requests that they set down their weapons. Legolas is the first to do so, but he informs the men that this bow came from the Lady of the Wood in Lothlorien. Hama quickly steps back from the weapon and assures Legolas that no one will even come close to touching it. Remember, they're all deathly afraid of the Witch of the Woods from their tales. Aragorn then hesitates and says that he will not put down his sword. Hama says that it's the will of Théoden, but Aragorn then says that he thinks his will trumps Théoden's, as he is the heir of Isildur, rightful heir to the throne of Gondor. Once again, book Aragorn is not afraid to name drop anywhere he goes, unlike movie Aragorn. Hama then says that it doesn't matter who he is because he is in the house of Théoden, and he moves towards the door with his sword out, saying that Aragorn would have to fight multiple men single-handedly to get past. Gimli, then being Gimli, speaks up and says that Aragorn wouldn't be alone, and Gandalf sees it's time to step in before a fight breaks out. He hands over his own weapon, Glamdring, and then tells Aragorn to set his weapon down as well, and Aragorn reluctantly does so, along with Gimli. However, Aragorn tells Hama that any man other than the heir of Isildur who touches the sword will die. Hama then tells Gandalf that he must also leave his staff, but Gandalf says that is foolishness and he'll wait outside for Théoden to hobble out if he insists on being so discourteous. Hama then smartly says that a staff in the hand of a wizard is more than a walking stick, but then he lets them in, saying that he thinks they mean no harm. Finally, after this drawn-out interaction, the four companions head into the hall to confront Wormtongue and Théoden head-on. I feel like I'm stating the obvious, but as you can see, Tolkien put a lot of emphasis on weapons and deep lore. Scenes like this one just show how much of that deep lore is removed to fit a film format. But once again, you have to wonder if they would have had time for these lines if they cut out the made-up bits in between these scenes. Now we can move on to Gandalf freeing Théoden from Saruman's spell. The first change in regard to the sequence has to do with Théoden's general demeanor while under the spell. I already mentioned his hair and eyes in the character changes, but here I want to point out that he stood up to greet Gandalf and could clearly get out multiple sentences. In the book, although under the ill guidance of Grima, he was still able to speak and interact with others just fine. Additionally, Éowyn is actually next to the king during this interaction, unlike the movie, which shows her suddenly walking in after the fight breaks out. Before we address the fight and Gandalf's big reveal, I do want to mention some lines that are left out of the movie. In the book, Grima isn't so much anti-war like they show in the movie, but rather he pins Gandalf as bringing no aid, only asking for help, but never bringing men, weapons, or goods, only taking. He then mentions that they are in league with the Sorceress of the Golden Wood, as Éomer had reported, and before Gimli can leap forward to chop off Grima's head, Gandalf begins singing a poem about Lorien. He then finishes and tells Grima that he has become a witless worm, and then he rips off his cloak and raises his staff, which brings us to the next change. The movie showcases a fight happening as Gandalf walks up to Théoden with his staff and the other three companions fight off Grima's thugs. This never happens in the book. Plus, Gandalf doesn't reveal himself as the White Wizard after his first attempt fails, but rather in the book, he reveals himself immediately. And finally, Gandalf doesn't battle Saruman like they show in the movie. Like I already mentioned, it wasn't so much that Saruman was channeling his voice through Théoden, as it was just Grima giving ill counsel to the king and keeping him shut up in the house. Now that I've mentioned those changes, let's break down what really happened in the book. After revealing himself as the White Wizard, Gandalf raised his staff and there could be heard a roll of thunder and a flash of lightning. He then pointed his staff to an opening in the hall, and sun shone through the clouds as Gandalf spoke to Théoden. The king then arose as the hall seemed to lighten, and with the help of Éowyn, he walked to the doors of the hall. Gandalf shouted for the doors to be opened as the Lord of the Mark comes forth, and Gandalf instructed the guards to go to the foot of the stairs and for Éowyn to leave the king. Théoden then spoke to Éowyn and told her that the time for fear is past and that she could leave him, and thus she did so. And that is the full extent of Gandalf's cure for the king. I know, pretty anticlimactic compared to the book. Essentially, Gandalf just has him walk outside. It's astonishing what a breath of fresh air can do. But something I think is worth mentioning here is actually Éowyn's exit. As she heads back inside, we get our first full description of her, and Tolkien writes that she looked back and met eyes with Aragorn. It's kind of a moment between them as they both, quote, beheld each other in all their glory. As we know, this love story isn't meant to be, but in the movie, they show Aragorn's first sight of Éowyn being the time that they ride up to the house and before they enter. Anyway, to move on to the next part of this scene, we see Théoden holding his sword and then dealing with Wormtongue. But in the book, there are a few things he must clear up first. First of all, in the book, he doesn't have immediate access to his sword, because Grima confiscated it, but we'll get to that part of the story in a moment. Second, Éomer is actually imprisoned in Edoras, and Gandalf has to request that Théoden have him brought forth. Then we have some very interesting dialogue that I just have to mention. You see, at this point, Théoden is a bit more clear of mind and breathing the fresh air. He now sees Grima's treachery, however, he isn't so quick to forgive his subjects, even Hama and Éomer. Gandalf asks if Éomer was in fact imprisoned, and Théoden says that he was because he directly disobeyed his orders and threatened to kill Grima inside of his home. Gandalf then wisely pointed out that one may be loyal to the king, but despise Wormtongue. Then Théoden said that since Hama has failed as a door ward, he will use him as an errand boy instead. He says, "Let the guilty bring the guilty to judgment," meaning that he will have Hama bring Éomer to be judged. That is because although it worked out for good, Hama still allowed Gandalf in with his staff against the king's orders. Tolkien writes that Théoden's voice was still harsh, but then as he looked at Gandalf, he smiled and the lines on his face faded away. Now the movie omits a conversation between Gandalf and Théoden, which I won't get into because we actually don't hear it. But from context clues, we can tell that Gandalf very quickly filled Théoden in on everything that has happened. We know this because Théoden gets up and says, "Alas for Boromir the Brave," meaning that Gandalf must have told him about Boromir's death. Then we have a very interesting line in which Théoden says, "Alas that these evil days should be mine, the young perish and the old linger." Sound familiar? Well, that's because in the movie, they paraphrase this sentiment when Théoden speaks with Gandalf after his son Theodred is buried. We'll touch on that here momentarily, but first we need to cover a key point, which is Théoden's sword and his dealing with Grima. You see, in the movie, Théoden holds his sword and then chases Wormtongue down the steps, nearly killing him, but Aragorn saves the day. Then, Wormtongue runs off after spitting on Aragorn's hand. In the book, this is completely different for many reasons. The first of which being that Éomer is omitted, as once again in the movie, he is out with the Banished Riders. But in the book, here is what happens. After Gandalf says that Théoden should hold his sword again, Éomer comes up the steps and offers his sword to the king. Now, this is kind of a funny moment, and I think Tolkien's way of injecting some comedy into his old English writing style. You know how I mentioned that Théoden was going to have the guilty bring the guilty? Well, Théoden is shocked and upset that Éomer has a sword, and Hama realizes his error. Hama tells the king that he thought the intention was to free Éomer, and therefore he gave a marshal back his sword, not realizing that Éomer was meant to be brought to Théoden so that Théoden could judge him. Regardless, Gandalf urges Théoden to take Éomer's sword as it was offered, and the king slowly does so. After grasping it, he suddenly swung it through the air and then shouted, "Arise now, arise, riders of Théoden. Dire deeds awake, dark is it eastward. Let horse be bridled, horn be sounded, forth Eolingus." Now don't go to the comments saying that I butchered that, I am no Bernard Hill. But in the book, this causes all the men to jump up and hurry to their king to hear his command. And Éomer remarks that it shall no longer be said that Gandalf only comes with grief. Okay, now we can address Grima's final moments in this scene. In the book, Théoden is brought his own sword eventually by Hama, who tells him that Wormtongue had it locked away in his chest. Théoden then does something very different from what the movie shows, but which is almost the same as killing Grima. In the movie, they show him about to kill Wormtongue by his own hand, but in the book, Théoden is a lot more merciful in wanting to let him prove his loyalty. He tells him that he'll ride with them into battle, and Grima hates this idea, groveling at Théoden's feet and begging for mercy. He then offers to stay back and watch over the people and govern in Théoden's absence. But Éomer laughs at this idea. Gandalf then speaks and says some familiar lines about Wormtongue. Suddenly, in a terrible voice to Grima, he says, "How long since Saruman bought you? What was the promised price? When all the men were dead, you were to pick your share of the treasure and take the woman you desire? Too long have you watched her under your eyelids and haunted her steps." Again, don't go to the comments, I'm not Carl Urban. Now, if this sounds familiar, it is once again some clever writing on the part of Jackson and his team, who utilized a lot of lines from moments that they cut. Instead, they gave these exact lines to Éomer in an earlier scene when he confronts Grima and gets banished. However, this once again brings up a valid question. If things were cut for time, how come they were able to make up scenes using the same lines? You see, the earlier scene of Éomer confronting Grima never happens in the book. So why cut the actual book scene and replace it with a fabricated one? Let me know what you think about this moment specifically in the comments below. Anyway, to wrap up this moment in the book, after Gandalf reveals the full extent of Wormtongue's treachery, Théoden mercifully gives him a choice: ride into battle and prove his worth, or leave now and never come back. Grima then spat at Théoden's feet and ran off, similarly to the movie version. Now that Wormtongue is out of the picture, we have a large plot hole to address, which is the inclusion of Theodred in these movies. I have touched on it before, and I mentioned it a few minutes ago, but it's important to cover again as this scene so specifically includes his funeral. Basically, Theodred has already died and been buried at the Fords of Isen. Therefore, this burial scene is completely made up. Théoden has already heard nearly 5 days before that his son had died. However, they did accurately draw inspiration from the books for these scenes. There are 2 things specifically that we can point to in regard to this. First, upon arriving at Edoras, Gandalf takes time to point out the burial mounds to Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. He even mentions the flowers on the burial mounds, which only grow on dead people, just like we see in the film. Second, because the burial scene never happens, this also means that Éowyn doesn't sing a lament for Theodred. However, this might have been inspired by an earlier moment in the chapter. After Gandalf points out the burial mounds to our 3 companions, Aragorn sings a soft poem in the language of the Rohirrim. The lyrics are completely different from what Éowyn sings in the movie, as her song is directly related to Theodred. But this poem from Aragorn could have possibly inspired Peter Jackson to include that later moment with Éowyn. After Gandalf and Théoden's conversation at Theodred's burial mound, which doesn't happen in the book, we have another change. The change actually takes up this entire scene, as it is the arrival of the 2 children we saw earlier in the movie. They are nowhere to be found in the book, and Théoden needs no introduction to the war that is upon them. In the movie, Jackson uses the children as a plot device to segue into the oncoming war, but Théoden is well aware of the growing darkness in the book. Plus, Gandalf has just filled him in on what is happening, so he's fully ready to discuss next steps. Which is another change from the movie, and boy oh boy is this a big one. I'm sure a lot of you have been waiting for this part, which is Théoden's decision to run to Helm's Deep. This might be a confusing change for some, as in the book they do indeed go to Helm's Deep, but the narrative is completely flipped on its head for the movie. You see, in the book, Théoden views Helm's Deep not as a place to hide and wait for the dark to pass, but rather a place to fight from and take down Saruman's forces. Here's what happens in the book. Théoden asks Gandalf for his counsel, and Gandalf tells him to ride out and fight Saruman, and have the women and children take provisions to hide in the mountains. Théoden agrees and then tells his guests to rest, but Aragorn quickly says that he promised Éomer his sword, and tells Théoden that he will ride out with Rohan. Gandalf then tells Théoden to lead his people to the hold of Dunharrow, which is to say that Gandalf is telling Théoden to go with the women and children. At this, Théoden says that Gandalf doesn't know his own skill in healing, as the king is ready to fight with his men. But this leaves a problem. Who will stay with the women and children to lead them? Well, that is later decided to be Éowyn, as Hama tells the king that all the people love and respect her, so Théoden appoints her as their leader, and she reluctantly does so, as she, just like in the movie, would rather go do battle. Anyway, after all that, here are the main differences. First, Gandalf is not opposed to Théoden taking his men to Helm's Deep for war, as in the book, Théoden is fully ready to fight. He isn't going to Helm's Deep to flee, but rather prepare his forces to wipe out Saruman. Second, the people of Rohan split up. The women and children are led by Éowyn to the hold of Dunharrow, and the men go to Helm's Deep for war. Now, before we end things off by going over some key moments at the end of the chapter, there are a string of scenes in the movie which are just completely made up to fill the viewer in on some context. There's not much I can dive into for these changes, so I'm just going to quickly list them off here. First, Aragorn never tames a horse. Second, we never read about Saruman speaking with Wormtongue about Théoden's plans. Third, Aragorn doesn't catch Éowyn wildly swinging a sword inside, which I gotta say is really dangerous. There's people walking around, lady. Fourth, Gamling and the rest of the men aren't sad like in the movie, but rather invigorated as their king is back and better than ever. They're going out to fight, not be cowardly like the film shows. And fifth, we don't hear Saruman sending out wargs, although they will show up later in the next chapter. Finally, now that we have finished up these scenes from the movie, there are a couple key moments I wanted to mention that happen in the book only, but we don't get to see at this point in the movie. First up is a moment of Éowyn offering a cup to Théoden and his guests. Much like what we see later after their success at Helm's Deep in the movie, Aragorn drinks from Éowyn's cup and they share another heartfelt moment as their hands touch. However, the key difference here is that it happens now in the book, whereas it happens later in the movie. Second, the movie omits Gandalf's acquisition of Shadowfax. In the film, we aren't filled in on these details, but in the book, Gandalf had been lent Shadowfax by Théoden earlier in his travels. At that point, the horse was reluctantly given as a way to simply get Gandalf to leave Edoras. But now, after Gandalf's rescue of the king, Théoden offered him a mighty gift. gift, and Gandalf requested Shadowfax to be his horse for good. Théoden accepted the request as it was well deserved, and from that point on, Shadowfax was officially Gandalf's horse. It's key to note that Gandalf does this because he tells Théoden he would never take something that isn't his own property into battle. Third and finally, we have a very unique moment between Gimli and Éomer. It looks like Legolas might have some competition because Éomer seems to be befriending the dwarf as well. You might recall from their previous encounter that Éomer insulted Galadriel and Gimli threatened him because of it. Well, at the tail end of their previous conversation, Gimli had told Éomer that he would return to teach him more gentle speech in regard to the Lady of the Wood, and now it's time that promise was fulfilled. Gimli spoke to Legolas about how he was ready to fight, but he didn't know how he would arrive at battle, as he could not ride a horse. He and Legolas then assumed that Gandalf and Shadowfax would bear him to war, but something else happened instead. Éomer rode up to them with the king and Gandalf, and he hailed Gimli, saying that he would not speak ill of the Lady of the Wood ever again. Gimli then told him that he would set aside his wrath for the time being, but that if Éomer were to ever see the Lady Galadriel, then he would have to acknowledge her as the fairest of ladies, or else their friendship would end. Éomer then agreed and asked Gimli to ride with him into battle. Not wanting to betray Legolas so quickly for another blonde guy, Gimli then tells Éomer that he would indeed ride with him as long as Legolas would be allowed to ride beside them. After this agreement, they all set off with Gandalf and Théoden at the head of the Rohirrim. So I know, per usual, I covered more than just Théoden here, as my job is to analyze the scenes as a whole and find every change. But now that you've heard it all, I'm curious what you think about these changes and how they affected the story. When you think about it, Peter Jackson starts Théoden as weak and scared, and then by the return of the king, he has a victorious end that makes everyone get emotional. That character arc is necessary to achieve the end result of tears. I'm not sure how attached I would have been if he would have started as a hero from the beginning and never faltered. Now, I know as we get deeper into Tolkien's writings, we'll see the book's version of his character development. But very clearly from this first encounter, we notice a couple things in Tolkien's version. First, Théoden isn't nearly as spellbound as in the movie. He simply has been shut up and ill-advised. Second, he tells Gandalf straight up that his healing has worked wonders and he is ready to ride into battle immediately. As I mentioned, Helm's Deep isn't a place to hide, but rather a place to defeat Saruman once and for all. And third, Théoden is a lot smarter right from the start, sending his women and children to a separate location to avoid the slaughter in the fight that is about to happen. All in all, we see two completely different characters. You could almost give them two different names and we would never know. But ultimately, Jackson and his team of writers did an amazing job creating a deep emotional character arc for this King of Men, which I really appreciate in the film format. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. As always, like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and check out the series playlist to binge watch all the episodes you might have missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.